Welcome to this week's Concurrency Beer 30. I'm Nathan Wisnowski, Concurrency Chief Technology Officer, and with me this week is Brian Haydin. Brian is Managing Architect in Concurrency's Modern Apps Practice. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks, Nate.
So, Brian, tell me a little bit about what you're drinking today.
I'm drinking Leinenkugels Oktoberfest. It's the fall, and nothing better than an Oktoberfest.
Awesome, awesome. Well, I'm drinking Supper Club. It seems to be a theme for me drinking Supper Club lately, but it's one of my favorites, and I really like it. So glad to be having that. So cheers.
Cheers.
All right. So we're here to talk a little bit about app portfolios. You do a lot of work with customers that are building enterprise application portfolios, ones that they're using to transform their businesses and engage their customers. Tell me a little bit about the challenges that companies have as they build up app portfolios and they look to use it as a product for transforming their business.
Yeah, so in a effective enterprise organization, you have a lot of sub-organizations that are trying to compete and build products and applications for their external customers. And it's great because they're incubating, they're creative, they're innovating at their own level, but they're not really sharing a global vision about what's going on. And so they struggle with this enterprise architecture, being able to pull all the different pieces together and make sure that there's a consistency in the delivery and keeping their brand focused on their customers.
So do you see that companies that maybe have a team that's focused on their applications consumers aren't necessarily working with the same customers that might be served by another applications consumers? They're trying to figure out how they work together, what the story is between those applications, how they might journey between them. Is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, a lot of these enterprise companies have a very diverse portfolio, and they're reaching out to customers maybe in the same sector, whether it's manufacturing sector or financial sector, but their business is very different from one room to the next. So being able to have a vision of how to pull identity together or how to service customers, being able to sell to customers through their e-commerce portals, having a strong enterprise vision for that is something that companies are definitely struggling with right now.
Limiting their cross-sell in a sense too, right?
Yeah, cross-selling, being able to cross-sell one application to the other. They're similar industries and they're in the same verticals, so being able to monetize in multiple areas is important for them.
What are you seeing from how companies make that prioritization of what they invest in? You know, like every application owner thinks their application is going to make the most money, going to be the most valuable for their customers' needs. You know, how are you seeing them make that differentiation between innovation 1 and innovation 2?
So the hardest part with the big corporation is how they work together to get that streamlined vision. So marketing has a very different set of goals than the product teams themselves. And the marketing teams tend to drive a lot of that customer focus. So getting those organizations to talk together is the critical part.
Got it. You know, when you see the relationship between the way marketing thinks about a customer and the way a product team thinks about a customer, you know, deep dive into that. Like what do you see as the difference in terms of how they look at that and how do they merge them back together?
So product teams are going to look at more customer-centric focus as far as usability for that particular product. What needs are being fulfilled by this product for that consumer? Marketing wants to look at how they're utilizing those products so that they can rebrand and remarket in other areas of the business. And they're tracking user utilization and they're looking at different metrics. But they are still looking at usability. They're trying to make a consistent brand across those platforms, marketing and the product teams. But it's just how you look at that data from an inverted perspective.
Interesting. You know, when you're taking something, let's say it wasn't currently a product, but it could be. You know, how do you go through that ideation process with a customer and say, this is something you're doing today, it's something valuable, maybe it's a very manual process, and here's a product ideation cycle that we go through to create something that might not only be valuable in itself, but map to other services you're delivering. What's that process look like?
First of all, to get to that point, you have to have exposure to multiple product groups to be able to understand what the consistencies that they're delivering. But you bring up a really good point. There's technologies out there that most of these companies don't really know that exist. And have a consulting company that actually knows what's coming forward. Concurrency is perfectly positioned with the number of MVPs that we have, that we see some of the product vision. We can actually predict for our customers what technologies are going to solve the problems they're currently having today. and we're in a position to be able to deliver like that.
Interesting. Okay. When you think about the relationship between people, products, technology, business, the kind of elements that come into play as you're doing product development, how much does technology lead versus people and asks lead? Where like maybe technology is pushing them to things that they wouldn't have thought about, a new idea, where a customer comes to the table and says, here's a need I have, and you figure out how to react to that need. Like, how those fit together?
Yeah, the customer is still driving that. So most companies that are doing it right are looking at a customer-centric approach, so CX, the customer experience, and that's actually driving what technology they're going to use to solve problems. I mean, really, at the end of the day, technology and innovation is about solving customers' problems. So that has to be the driving factor. I can build you an application that does some really cool things, but if the customers don't need it or they don't want it, they're not going to use it.
Totally agree. Like, you could light up something that looks cool, has blinky lights, but the customer may not actually find it travels the journey they wanted to travel.
Yeah, and that's such a great point with Agile, that the whole principle is, let's get things in front of the customers to use first before we start building full-featured products. That way you can see how they're using it and what their behavior is, and you can pivot on those features or on what you're planning on building to actually fulfill their needs.
So do you feel like when companies are making those decisions about what products to invest in, do you feel like they do a good job of getting that customer experience information, and what can they do better than?
They really don't, actually. Most Fortune 50 companies are going to have UX teams or CX teams that are going to dive into this information, but they're still so siloed that they're not utilizing it across the organization. You really need to have a global team or an enterprise-wide team that's going to help you with that.
So when you engage companies that are responding to customer asks, or even feature asks, they keep enhancing the current product that they have, do they get stuck in that rut sometimes where they keep enhancing what they have rather than thinking about what the industry is doing and how the industry might be sort of turning the market on its head, and they need to be prepared to disrupt?
There is a general trend for most companies to listen to the squeakiest wheel and try to address that. And a lot of times that's just enhancing a small feature rather than taking a look at the bigger picture, right? So one of my favorite authors is Clayton Christensen, and his jobs theory of what job is this tool supposed to do, and what job is it solving for me. And I think that more companies need to look at that perspective rather than the squeaky wheel method.
Yeah, I think a lot of companies, they think about, if I've got a drill, it's because I need to make a hole, and then I need to use that hole to fasten two things together. But I think the question that sometimes people might have to ask is, why do I have to fasten them?
Right.
Or if I'm fastening them, why do I need a hole in the first place? It's the things beyond the what's right in front of me. Maybe it's the thing that they're trying to do in the first place and why.
Yeah. And one of the great things that we're able to do is to really talk with our customers' leaders and figure out what direction they're looking to go and help them with those innovative solutions.
Like really inventing something that may not even be in the market yet to serve their customers' needs in a more consistent way.
Right. I had a client that was spending months and years actually innovating with a new technology, and they had a bunch of hardware engineers that were developing this widget, just called widgets. And I said, there's plenty of off-the-shelf stuff that you can use that's going to proof of concept this and really change what you're trying to do. Let's give it a shot. And within a month, we were able to build some POC that they were able to use to really rebrand what they're trying to do with that line of business. So technology is out there to solve the problem, but you have to understand what the problem is first. And a lot of times it takes an outsider to really see that vision.
Interesting. When you think about this from an enterprise architecture standpoint, of like information security, information protection, trust standpoint, you're building enterprise applications, each of which have their own purpose. Are there aspects of those applications that should be shared components? Things where you're sort of not leaving it up to an individual developer to make a decision. You're trying to provide some level of control and governance and trust in a layer of that app portfolio.
You have to. You absolutely have to. So we encourage companies to standardize those approaches, especially identity. I mean, you talk about That's one of the big areas where we help out companies create a consistent experience, leveraging either Azure Active Directory or B2C are some of the things that we actually do and do very successfully. It really gives everybody a consistent experience regardless of what product they're subscribing to within that customer's portfolio. And that identity is managed in such a way that they don't have to then worry about all the security features and having penetration tests on each one of the applications, because they know that there's already an enterprise-wide solution for that.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. Especially in the identity space where there's so many opportunities to be able to enhance it, conditional access and so on.
Right, and it's a complex area, and most companies aren't going to have the kind of really deep technical knowledge to be able to implement something like that. And so to be able to leverage Concurrency's staff to do that is great. But we have a lab partnership with Microsoft to be able to implement some of those features that companies may not have access to.
Got it. Back up to the business level, when you talk about monetization of platforms, you build platform 1 or platform 2, they deliver something to their customers, they have data that exists behind it. What are some areas of monetization that companies don't always think about, or ones that that are later on down their list that they should be considering sooner?
So cross-selling is a really difficult experience. You have an application that you've already sold to the customer and you want to be able to get more revenue out of them. And so there's a lot of strategies of being able to do a feature development versus a product development. So you're selling features to a product rather than just selling access to the product.
Got it. So you're selling access to certain types of capabilities that follow a customer story, a customer need.
Yeah, look at the way that the world, really, the e-commerce market's going from a day-to-day standpoint. You're spending more money on Uber, which is they do one thing really, really well, and that's the only thing that you really need.
Yep.
You might also use Uber Eats as they expand their business, but you're really looking for the food at that point. You're not necessarily looking for the rides. So companies need to get smarter about that and be able to capitalize on customers that are coming in for a specific type of experience, and not say we're just going to sell you this big product that costs you $500 a month.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, sometimes I think we're seeing the simplification of an experience like Uber, not having to carry cash with you, to get in a cab and know where the guy's going and tell him where you're going. Like, it's just a lot easier to take your app out and tell him where you want to go and get in the car and have a travel there, right? Like,
yeah.
There's this disruption that we're causing, and then the relationship between Uber sold and the market of getting a ride, but then now Uber Eats, and the relationship between those two things starts to cross market. And that's what any company can kind of look at, right? Is they have a portfolio, and they may not even be directly related services, but they might be ones that I want both of those services.
Yeah, absolutely. So you do need to do that, and you need to have that structure across the organization to be able to take information from one line of business into the other, and that's where that enterprise architecture is really important.
Got it. Where do you see the relationship of the data coming into play? And it's tricky, right? Because we care about customer privacy. We care about what I give a company is also not misused by that company. But then there's also scenarios where the data can be cross-capitalized to provide value to the customer too. Like, how do you manage that line, and what's the right place to be using data in your applications network?
When I answer that last question, I knew you would go to the data part of that, because that's really where I was going with it. So the data strategy is extremely important at the enterprise level. Not only do you want to cross-use that information, but then you have to worry about compliance in different countries and different geographic regions. So that's a really complex. So it's probably the entire new talk for us to have, right? But yeah, that's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Talk about GDPR and the compliance here. It's just vastly different.
Yeah, like Facebook got themselves in a bunch of trouble there, right? Like, you could say they were making the experience better for everybody, but then on the flip side, it really struck a chord on information privacy and managing that customer experience and what's acceptable and what's not. It doesn't feel like it's really been entirely solved yet.
No, not yet. Absolutely, it really isn't solved at all. And you're seeing a tug of war right now between people wanting to own their data and companies wanting to monetize that. So having a good corporate strategy in place so that you can pivot is really important at this point.
I think it comes along to like intent, allowing a person to have the intent of allowing their data to use in a certain way. But then what is that informed consent that goes along with applications? And do I really ever have informed consent that goes along with those applications in a certain way?
So the phrase I've heard before is, if you're not paying for the product, you're not the customer. Mm-hmm. So I think people need to be a little bit more mindful about that.
That's a good point.
That if you aren't paying for something, you just have to assume that the company's trying to collect your information for some other purpose.
Good point. Good point. And maybe even if you are the paying customer. Right?
And maybe if you are paying the customer, your information is probably being used in ways that you might not want it to be.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So maybe one last question, kind of from a practitioner standpoint. Let's say that I'm an architect, I'm involved in building applications for some time, and I'm trying to level up. I'm trying to do the kinds of things that you're doing and engaging the business and becoming smarter about that and transform what I do. What are the skills I need to think about beyond just the technology space?
So in the technology space, you start looking at very focused, how do I solve this problem? And now I'm trying to look at what is the problem that's trying to be solved to begin with. And so being able to shift out of that is one of the more difficult skill sets. Letting go of the technical day-to-day operations is also extremely hard. I'm sure that you're aware.
It's hard, man.
Yeah, it is.
It's like letting go of your best friend.
It really is. It really is. But you don't really have the time to look at some of those creative, innovative ideas if you're focused too much on moving cards across the Kanban board. So I would say probably the biggest skill set that you need at that point is just letting go.
Got it. That's good advice. Okay, last question. What makes you love what you're doing? You're engaged with these customers. You're doing some really powerful things. You're engaged in transforming what they do. What makes you love getting up in the morning and doing that?
So at the end of the day, when I see the kind of change at the organizations, that's really what makes me tick. So being able to have those kind of strategic conversations and give them some guidance and really move the needle for a company is what's important to me.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
Cheers.
Cheers. Nice seeing you.
You bet.
And thank you for joining us on Concurrency Beer 30.